Stretching is a critical step in our pizza making process, and that's the reason why I've decided to dedicate an entire masterclass on it. Hi, I'm Sergio. I'm a professional pizza trainer from Italy, based in France, and in this masterclass, we're going to talk about stretching. The objective is to share with you several things. Stretching techniques, according to the product that you're realizing, help you avoid some of the worst mistakes, and share with you some theoretical notions that will definitely help you improve your stretching. Stretching is not just the act of pulling our pizza and to make it thin, but it's actually a set of specific movements and techniques that need to be applied differently depending on what kind of dough and what kind of pizza we're preparing. The objective of this chapter is to exactly look at the different technique that you can use depending on the product and the dough that you're stretching. Contemporary Neapolitan pizza requires a dough with the gluten that is very extensible and sufficiently elastic to produce a dough that is easy to work with, well developed and light in the crust. So when you stretch it, if everything is done right, you end up with a dough that's easy to stretch, but with slight resistance and strength. This dough is full of gas and, above all, well hydrated. So I prefer to use a pressing technique first. With the contemporary dough, always make sure to leave 1 to 2 centimeters of dough around the crust. If the gluten is well developed, the dough will give us a light crust around the edge. Next, I'm going to finish the stretching on my fists to help me get to the final size. Here, gravity does most of the work. Stretching this type of dough abruptly and directly can result in an uneven dough and also risk making the dough too elastic, because the more you pull and touch the gluten, the more elastic it becomes. Here you have the dough for contemporary Neapolitan pizza, correctly stretched. The traditional Neapolitan pizza differs from the contemporary version in that it's even more extensible. With this dough, you can easily use several techniques. Personally, I stick to the pressing technique used for the contemporary version. But to finish stretching the dough, I use the traditional schiaffo technique, the slap, which is a little aggressive but gives a very even and successful result with this type of dough. The edge left on the traditional Neapolitan pizza is very small, barely 1 centimeter. And here we go with the final result. Roman pizza is characterized by a gluten that is relatively similar to the traditional Neapolitan pizza, so with a great extensibility. As with the other doughs, the initial goal is to spread the dough at least a bit, and here I keep my fingers wide apart to retain some of the gas that will create the bubbles typical of the Roman pizza. Here we're working with a dough that is less than 60% hydrated, so we can use the DJ technique. One hand holds the center of the dough and the other stretches it. You will notice the excellent extensibility of the dough. The final result is a thin, evenly spread dough. For interior Roman pizza, the stretching process changes radically. We're working with a dough that must remain thick everywhere and therefore requires a different stretching technique. The hands are open in order to spread the dough without completely flattening the surface, especially to keep most of the fermentation gases inside. The dough should be slightly extensible, but with a good elasticity and resistance, which indicates that the gluten has developed properly. Especially if you're used to stretching Neapolitan pizzas, stretching interior Roman pizza dough can result in an uneven dough with the center that is thinner than the edges. What is important for this pizza is that the dough is evenly thick throughout the surface. Once in the baking tray, I stretch it further to cover the entire surface. And here it is, the result before adding the toppings. After I've been training more than 1,000 students here in France, I noticed some common mistakes during stretching, and the objective of this chapter is to exactly share with you the 6 most common mistakes and share with you what to do to avoid them. When removing the dough, we need to do it quickly to avoid folding it. A folded dough will most likely result in a rectangular rather than round pizza, because depending on the dough, it can be very difficult to restore the round shape. Here, I almost succeeded to restore the round shape, but with a more elastic dough, it would have been even worse. With the dough such as the contemporary Neapolitan pizza, pulling the dough too much can cause it to break. Here I'm stretching the dough really hard rather than applying a pressure. And the dough is tearing. I would like to point out that the dough used here had very good extensibility, as it should, and therefore the tearing happens very quickly. Here I'm making 3 mistakes: stretching the dough aggressively, as in the previous mistake, and also bringing too much dough towards the edges, making the center too thin. Then, while stretching the dough on my fists, I'm placing the hand right in the center. What's the final result? The center is too thin and it might break later, and there is too much dough towards the edges. Be aware that this problem can also occur with a good stretching technique, but with the dough that is too weak. Removing the dough without semolina causes the dough ball we're removing to lose their shape. The dough ball will not be round, and if I continue to spread it incorrectly, the round shape of the pizza will be completely compromised. So be careful to use semolina when removing the dough ball from its tray. If no semolina is used on the work surface, the result will be even worse. The dough will certainly stick and it will be impossible to stretch it properly. The dough will probably tear when you try to turn it over, so be sure to always use semolina during stretching. When stretching a dough such as Neapolitan pizza, your fingers should be fairly flat and not vertical. What's the risk? Making a hole in the pizza with your fingernails. And even if you don't make a hole in the dough, there is another problem with stretching. The dough won't be thin and homogeneous, and you will end up with small bumps all over the place. This will mean the final pizza won't be thin everywhere. Whether you do your pizzas at home or in a professional environment, you certainly experienced already a dough that is difficult to stretch. Common belief is that a dough that is difficult to stretch is linked to a lack of good technique. The reality is different. When we cannot stretch properly our dough, when we have a dough that is too elastic, too strong, the problem is the gluten. Stretching is in fact a step in our pizza making process that comes at the end of our recipe. Once we've chosen our flour, our hydration, and especially we've carried out the different fermentations of our dough. And so when we stretch our dough, the gluten that we have between our hands is the result of everything that we've done during the recipe. In other words, the problem of a dough that is difficult to stretch is to look into the gluten and how we carried out the recipe. So in order to better understand what comes into play when the dough is difficult to stretch and also all the possible causes, let's look at a real example. Here we have a dough for contemporary Neapolitan pizza with 66% hydration that has been prepared incorrectly. The gluten in our dough behaves like an elastic band with a certain amount of extensibility and tenacity. A successful recipe gives us the right balance between tenacity and extensibility. But if on the other hand we give the dough too much tenacity, it will be too resistant during stretching. You can see the dough in this video. Despite being stretched several times, it remains small. The gluten is too elastic and tough. There is no single solution to this problem, as the solution varies depending on the recipe. Understanding which solution to implement in your recipe is one of the key topics of my training courses. But if you want to evaluate the options, you need to look at 3 key elements: the flour, the hydration, and the fermentation. these three parameters together will have the greatest impact on the balance between the dough extensibility and tenacity. For this dough, even though I managed to roll it out to 30 centimeters, the proof that there is a problem with the gluten is that the pizza shrunk after baking. You can see we went from 30 centimeters to around 25-26. Can we create a light crust in our pizza just by stretching our dough in a certain way? The answer is no. A light and airy crust depends primarily on the gluten that we formed during our recipe. In fact, it's the level of elasticity of our gluten that will impact whether or not we can achieve this developed and airy crust. So once we created the right gluten during our recipe, it's important to combine the right stretching technique as we saw in the first chapter in order to keep all the fermentation gases in our dough. And it's the combination between the right gluten and the right stretching technique that will give us effectively the final result that we want in terms of the lightness of the crust. To best visualize this link between stretching and the development of the crust, let's look at some real examples. Let's first look at traditional Neapolitan and Roman pizza. You can see that during stretching, the dough does not retain the fermentation gases, which are effectively released. This is normal because the gluten obtained during the recipe will give us an extensible dough with no elasticity, and this result will give us a very thin pizza with no crust. If you try instead to leave a crust, there will be no air, no lightness, just dough inside. On the other hand, in the dough for contemporary Neapolitan pizza or interior Roman pizza, we want to follow a recipe to obtain a gluten that has good elasticity and that will give us a light crust. Here you can see that when the dough is stretched, it retains the fermentation gases, thanks to the good gluten obtained during the resting period. If the recipe is not followed correctly, this lightness will not be present, regardless of how the dough is stretched. In other words, if I leave 3 centimeters of dough around the crust and the gluten does not have the right elasticity, the crust will be just full of dough and not airy and light. We've come to the end of this masterclass about stretching. I really hope this video brought you a better understanding of stretching both from a practical but also theoretical point of view. If you arrived to this point of the video, you understood by now that in order to have a dough that it's easy to stretch, we need to focus our attention on gluten. Managing the gluten and managing the elasticity throughout the recipe of our dough is the key to obtain a good product besides an easy dough to stretch. And if you wish to better understand how to manage your gluten in order to reach the quality of your pizza and especially regularity in your results, I suggest you look at my pizza training, in which you will receive the methodology to master your dough and to reach quality, consistency and regularity. The link is just below in the description. I'm Sergio, I'm a professional pizza trainer, and thanks for watching. Ciao e buona pizza!